In a survey, what you're doing is asking people questions about their opinions. And then you have to convert their answers into data, that is, numbers that you can analyze. The instruments you use to measure opinions are called scales, and the process of converting their answers into numbers is called scaling. Understanding what scales to use and how to use them effectively is one of the most important aspects of market research. Questionnaires are made up of scales, and so before we can talk about how to design a questionnaire, we have to decide what our choices are in terms of scales that we can use. While there are many different ways in which we can ask questions and scale the responses, there are in fact only 4 basic types of scales. That's what we will discuss in this module. There are 4 basic types of scales: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scales. Nominal and ordinal scales are considered to be non-metric scales. They imply a less precise level of measurement, and the kinds of analysis you can do with them is very limited. Interval and ratio scales are called metric or quantitative scales, and they imply more precise measurement and can be used with more advanced analysis. Nominal scales are those where the numbers are used as labels to identify the type of response, and the values themselves have no meaning. For example, subway lines in New York City are numbered 1, 2, 3, etc. The numbers themselves don't have any function other than to identify the lines. With an ordinal scale, the number values have some meaning. A higher value can mean that there is more of what you're measuring, or it could mean there is less. Either way, the number has some meaning. For example, when you rank colleges based on how good they are, you're using an ordinal scale. But it's important to note that the difference between rank 1 and rank 2, or between rank 2 and rank 3, is unknown. It could be a small difference or a large one. An interval scale is like an ordinal scale, but it is much more precise because the difference between consecutive numbers is assumed to be equal. That is, the difference between the numbers 1 and 2 is equal to that between 2 and 3, 3 and 4, etc. This is a very powerful property because it allows us to analyze these numbers statistically. Finally, a ratio scale represents the most precise use of numbers. Interestingly, this is also how we use numbers in our daily life. Ratio scales are like interval scales, but in addition they have a real or meaningful 0 point. That is, the number 0 on a ratio scale means that there is a 0 amount of whatever you're measuring. This real 0 point allows us to take ratios of amounts. That is, we can make statements like, I like Coke twice as much as Pepsi, or I have lived in this city twice as long as in any other city. Knowing what type of scale you have is important because it determines what type of analysis you can do with the numbers. Here are some examples of each scale type. In a survey, if you ask about gender, you would assign the value 1 if someone checks male and the value 2 if they check female. The number 1 or 2 doesn't mean anything. It just identifies the type of answer they gave. That's a nominal scale. You could look at the frequency distribution of people in the two groups, but you couldn't average the responses to this question. If you ask someone to indicate their age group and you assign the values 1 to under 21, 2 to 21 to 30, 3 to 31 to 40, and so on, the numbers 1, 2, 3, etc. would be ordinal numbers. This is because a higher number indicates a higher age. Of course, this is an imprecise measure of age because we don't know exactly how old they are. So the difference between someone who checks a 1 and someone who checks a 2 could be large, or it could be small. We have no way of knowing. You could look at the frequency distribution for this variable or the median value of the responses to find out how many people checked a 1 or 2 as compared to 3 or higher. But again, you couldn't average these numbers because they are not precise enough. Here's an example of an interval scale, a scale from 1 to 5 with 1 labeled poor and 5 labeled excellent. When people respond using the scale, they instinctively assume that 3 is the midpoint between 1 and 5. 2 is the midpoint between 1 and 3, and so on. That is, they assume that the difference between 1 and 2 is the same as between 2 and 3, 3 and 4, etc. That is the defining property of the interval scale, and it allows you to calculate the mean and standard deviation and do most types of statistical analysis. However, the one thing you cannot do is take ratios of the values. For example, if someone rated a product as a 1 on this scale and someone else rated it as a 2, you cannot assume that the second person liked the product twice as much as the first. Finally, ratio scales are used in daily life all the time. Whenever you count anything, you're using a ratio scale. For example, when you measure sales, your income in dollars, how many cars or TV sets you own, how much you spent at dinner, etc., you're using a ratio scale. The big advantage of ratio scales is that you can do pretty much any kind of analysis you want, including taking ratios of numbers. The reason you can do that is that it has a real 0 point. That is, if someone says they have zero income, it means there is an absence of income. Next, let's see which scales are commonly used in market research. Demographics are usually measured using nominal scales, for example, when you ask about zip code, marital status, etc. Ordinal scales, for example, when you ask someone to indicate their income category or age group. And ratio scales, when you count something, for example, when you ask someone to write their age in years or income in dollars. Interval scales are not usually used for demographics. Attitude can be measured in many ways, most often using interval scales. But we can also measure it by asking people to rank objects based on their attitude, which gives us an ordinal scale, or by asking them to assign points, which gives a ratio scale. Let's take a quick look at each of these examples. Let's start with rank order scales. Here's an example. Please rank the following websites based on how attractive you think they are, with 1 being the most attractive and 3 being the least attractive. Please give a different rank to each website. These scales are popular with market researchers because they appear to be simple to use, but they have a number of limitations. First, since they are non-metric scales, you cannot do much analysis. Calculating mean rankings, for example, is usually not appropriate. Second, if you have more than a few choices, the ranking task becomes too difficult for the respondent. Third, asking for a ranking assumes that all respondents are aware of the alternatives and can make meaningful comparisons between them, which is often not true. For all these reasons, we use rank order scales only when it is essential to do so. Here's an example of a numerical scale, which is a scale where only the endpoints are labeled. In this example, poor and excellent. The scale points in between are not labeled. This approach of leaving the in-between categories unlabeled has certain advantages, as we will discuss later. A constant sum scale is the only commonly used ratio scale in market research. It's not used that often because it depends on the respondent understanding and following the instructions, which may be unlikely. An important limitation of the scale is that it is useful for measuring relative amounts of the construct, but not absolute amounts. For example, I may dislike all the alternatives equally, but I would still have to give each alternative equal points, which would be the same as if I liked them equally. So it can be misleading in certain situations. Here's a scale that you'll see a lot. It's called a Likert scale, and it refers to this specific format. You have a set of statements, and you have a set of scales ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. It is a multi-item scale, that is, it consists of multiple items, that is, questions, that are used together to measure the underlying construct. The statements are usually generated through focus groups or similar methods and represent various aspects of the product or service. With each statement, there is an agree-disagree scale, which is labeled as shown here. To measure perceptions, we use mainly interval scales, including some that we have seen examples of. The most commonly used one is called a semantic differential scale, which we will look at briefly. The semantic differential consists of a series of opposite words or phrases. Respondents are asked to circle a number for each item that best reflects their impression of the product or service. For example, on one side of the scale, in the first item, you have abundance of exhibits. On the right side, you have scarcity of exhibits. The second item has complex user registration, and the right side has simple user registration. So you have opposites on each end of the scale. As with Likert scales, we would have a mix of positive and negative words on the left and right sides. When we analyze this data, we calculate the mean rating on each item, and for ease of interpretation, we present the data by plotting the means on the items and connecting them with a line. This is called a snake chart. When we measure attribute importance, we can use any type of scale other than nominal. For example, we can ask people to rank attributes based on importance. We can ask them to rate attributes on a numerical scale. Or we can use a constant sum scale to generate a ratio scale measure. I recommend that instead of ordinal scales, you use interval or ratio scales here for ease of analysis.